I know he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, but for everyone I say, the British Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt said on Monday he would freeze the expansion of the country's public services and aim to return them to pre-pandemic size, a plan he said could cost up to £1 billion next year. Hunt said the UK now employs 66,000 more civil servants than before the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020, and the plan to reduce the number of civil servants is aimed at reducing costs in the long term. Did I say it costs? No, it reduces costs. I'm stopping the expansion of the public service and implementing a plan to reduce the number of civil servants to pre-pandemic levels. That will save £1 billion next year. That's what he told the ruling Conservative Party's annual conference in Manchester. The government said in a further statement that the number of employees would immediately be limited to the current level, although this should not be equated with a hiring freeze. There are currently around 488,000 civil servants overall. Ministries would also be asked to submit plans to reduce staffing levels to pre-pandemic levels in the coming years, as the Finance Ministry said. Equality, diversity and inclusion spending will also be reviewed to ensure it delivers value for money for taxpayers. Oh, here we go again. However, he says the minimum wage will rise in the UK next year, but there also will be no immediate tax cuts. With inflation remaining high across the channel, British Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt speaks at the Conservatives' annual conference on Monday within a week of limited budgetary constraints. The Conservatives remain behind in the polls, with the next general election expected to take place in January 2025 at the latest, increasing their announcements during the party's annual conference, which began in Manchester on Sunday. Work has to be worth it, and we will make sure of it, says excerpts from the speech that the minister gave on Monday and which the party had announced in advance. This is the Conservative Party's way of improving the lives of working people. That's what he said. The minimum hourly wage is currently £10.42, and from April 2024 will be increased to at least £11 per hour. But with inflation falling, it still is the highest in the G7 in a year, with 6.7% in August. Jeremy Hunt is resisting pressure from within his own ranks, including the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, to cut taxes. This Conservative government is determined to get us on the path to lower taxes as quickly as possible, but if we made big tax cuts now, that would put more money in people's pockets and fuel inflation. That's how he argued against it on Monday morning in Sky News. According to Jeremy Hunt, reducing inflation will ultimately be more effective in increasing Britain's purchasing power. A proponent of budget orthodoxy, Jeremy Hunt entered government almost a year ago to calm markets after a budget proposal presented by Liz Truss' government involving massive and unfunded spending, and that caused panic and drove up UK government borrowing rates, and it was a catastrophe on the markets. And the finance minister also rejected calls from his Conservative Party for these rapid tax cuts. I believe in cutting taxes, but we don't know at the moment whether that will be possible before the next election. That's what he said on Monday. Any tax cuts this year would fuel inflation, and this would make it more difficult for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to halve the inflation rate by the end of the year, as he promised. And there are still a lot of demands within his own government for tax cuts, and that before the election expected in 2024. And that puts Sunak under a lot of pressure. I want to see the tax cut burden cut before the next election, is what influential Housing, Communities and Local Government Secretary Michael Gove told Sky News on Sunday. Workers should be the focus of such a reduction. Others in Sunak's party are also pushing for tax cuts. According to the Non-Partisan Institute for Fiscal Studies, tax revenue is likely to account for 37% of annual economic output at the time of the next election. That is the highest proportion in Britain since at least the 1950s. A new poll from polling firm Opinion shows Labour's lead has shrunk to its narrowest margin since Sunak became Prime Minister a year ago. But it still remains in double digits. This year's British Conservative Party conference in Manchester was marked by chaos. I talked about this week already. Getting there was difficult because a railway strike paralyzed the transport network, and delegates, lobbyists and media representatives struggled to reach the conference venue, which is, and that was hilarious, a former train station. On site, they then had to fight through loud demonstrations on the occasion of the doctors' strike that had been going on for months. For party and government leader Rishi Sunak, the party conference was intended to polish his image and improve his party's prospects, and it's still ongoing when I'm filming this. The Conservatives have been around 20% behind the opposition Labour Party in the polls for months. Looks a bit better now, but not that much. And Sunak tries to spread hope and optimism and presents himself as a change agent. His strategy is based on presenting himself as a competent alternative to his chaotic predecessors Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And that's why change is his motto, and it's intended to complement his original motto of long-term decisions for the good of the country. Haven't seen any so far. This theme is intended to convey to voters that he can bring about change. But first of all, the change refers to corrections of errors from the 13 years of Conservative government. And these include, among other things, the watering down of climate targets, iron budgetary discipline after fiscal incontinence, and the shortening of the planned high-speed line between London and Manchester. The right-wing party now presents itself as the patron saint of driving, and Sunak's plans to ban 30-kilometer zones in city centres and reject initiatives to reduce car traffic in residential areas. And in addition, no fees should be introduced for older diesel and petrol vehicles. Sunak announced he will put an end to the war on drivers, as he put it, and he also rejected plans just like the tax for eating meat and the introduction of 6 different garbage cans. The British Conservatives do face major challenges. Sunak and his colleagues hope that the Conservative rank and file will go into the 2024 election campaign united and with vigor, and possible candidates for his successor are already available in Manchester, including Gillian Keegan, Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman and Liz Truss. However, unity within the party appears to be kind of non-existent. And I mentioned it earlier in another video, but a cartoon in the Sunday Times described the state of the party with the word, it's an advert for the Labour Party, and that's hilarious. Rishi Sunak's future remains uncertain with this, and the betting officers are skeptical about his chances. The question remains whether he can present himself as a change candidate and bring about change in the end. Only the coming months and years will show whether Sunak can live up to his motto. But around 50 Tory MPs have already decided not to stand at the next election. And several of the party's rich patrons have cancelled party donations or even want to support the Labour Party in the future. And that's a big hit. So that means that a large number of MPs did not even come to the current party conference in Manchester. British commentators are predicting that Sunak's first party conference speech could also be his last. Not improbable. The Prime Minister must announce the election before the end of January 2025, so they will probably take place in spring or autumn next year. And with a series of radical plans, Sunak is now trying to find new support among the electorate and kind of re-motivate his party. At the party conference, he wanted to present himself above all as the friend of drivers, as I said, who will put a stop to control-mad Labour city councillors, such as the introduction of nationwide speed limits in more and more municipalities and other, as he says, crazy restrictions in the road areas. In the last 2 weeks, Sunak had already caused a stir by quickly cancelling or postponing measures that had already been decided against climate change and by authorizing the exploitation of huge new oil and gas fields in the North Sea. He explained that his financially overwhelmed compatriots simply could not be expected to do anything else. You have to be pragmatic here. And this U-turn led to protests from many Green Tories, while the Tory right wing applauded Sunak for it. The assurance by the far-right Interior Minister Suella Braverman, our Home Secretary, that if it became necessary to contain the flow of refugees, Great Britain could easily withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, that also triggered very different reactions. Concerned Tories warned of the enormous damage such a departure would do to Britain's international reputation. However, the head of government has not yet ruled out such a step. At the beginning of the week, the party conference delegates were also eagerly waiting for Sunak to make a decision on the hot issue of the new HS2 express rail route from London to Northern England. Because the costs of the project have multiplied, and government headquarters recently signaled that they were only considering running the route as far as Birmingham and no further up to Manchester. Ex-Prime Minister Johnson said also on the weekend that something like that would be an outright betrayal of the North by Sunak. Betrayal of the North. Sounds a bit like Game of Thrones. Sunak also finds himself under heavy pressure on the tax issue. His predecessor Truss and her allies are demanding an immediate reduction in the debt burden, as they put it. But Sunak and Chancellor Hunt, as I said in the beginning of the video, have signaled that they would prefer to wait before cutting income tax, but could easily imagine the total abolition of inheritance tax. A reduction in social benefits is also being considered in order to reduce government spending. So Sunak speaks to a party that is in a serious crisis. With record-high mortgages and rents, the highest taxes since the Second World War, ongoing labor disputes, a serious health system crisis, unresolved refugee issues, and the first bitter consequences of their hard Brexit, the Conservatives have lost a lot of popularity since their 2019 election victory. They are also still troubled by the memory of the chaos of Boris Johnson's end times last summer and of Liz Truss' catastrophic 49-day term in office, which cost the United Kingdom dearly, and she really wants to come back. According to a survey by the Sunday newspaper Observer, Sunak must expect that a third of Tory voters in 2019 will choose a different party this time. This doesn't change that the gap between Tories and Labour closed a little bit, but still double-digit ahead for Labour. That just means that people might not go to Labour, but to the Liberal Democrats instead, to SNP, to the Greens, God knows where, but not to the Tories. And that will be the major point of importance here. And if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.